Alec's car crawled through the suffocating fog that clung to the desolate road like an oppressive shroud. His headlights barely pierced the mist, illuminating only fleeting glimpses of skeletal trees with twisted, claw-like branches. The GPS had failed him miles ago, leaving him with only the whisper of an urban legend to guide him. The cursed mansion known as the House of Eternal Mirrors. Locals spoke of it in hushed tones, describing it as a place where reflections moved on their own and shadows seemed to breathe. Alec dismissed the stories as superstitious nonsense, but his curiosity had led him this far, and now there was no turning back. The mansion emerged suddenly from the fog, its silhouette towering and grotesque. The structure seemed to lean toward him, as if inviting him, or daring him, to enter. The facade was crumbling, its once grand stone walls marred by vines that pulsed faintly, as though alive. The windows, however, were pristine, unnervingly so, reflecting not the foggy expanse around them, but a clear, starless night. Alec's stomach churned as he stepped out of the car, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. As he approached, the massive wooden door creaked open of its own accord, revealing a narrow hallway lined with mirrors that stretched into an impenetrable darkness. A draft whispered past him, carrying with it a faint sound, a child's laughter, soft and fleeting, yet impossibly close. He froze, his breath hitching, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. There was nothing, but the laughter lingered in his ears, mingling with the rapid thud of his heart. The mirrors immediately drew his attention. They weren't dusty or cracked, as one would expect in a place abandoned for decades. Instead, they gleamed with a sinister perfection, their surfaces rippling slightly, as though the reflections were submerged in water. Alec's own image stared back at him, but something was off. His reflection seemed slower, the movements a fraction of a second behind his own. He waved a hand experimentally, and for a brief, horrifying moment, his reflection didn't move at all. It simply stared at him, its eyes darker than they should have been. Alec stumbled backward, his foot crunching on shards of glass. Startled, he looked down and saw a broken hand mirror on the floor. Its jagged edges reflected fragments of his face, each piece slightly distorted, the eyes in one shard unnervingly lifelike. He shivered, clutching his camera tightly. The device had always been his shield, a way to distance himself from the world by capturing it through a lens. But here, in this place, it felt like a flimsy barrier against the growing sense of dread. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the mirrors multiplying, their angles creating an overwhelming labyrinth of reflections. As Alec ventured deeper, he noticed subtle changes in the reflections. Some didn't show him at all. Instead, they revealed glimpses of empty rooms, flickering candles, and faint silhouettes that didn't exist in the physical world. His fingers itched to raise his camera and snap a photo, but something stopped him. A primal instinct that warned him not to capture whatever existed in those mirrored depths. A sudden chill washed over him, and with it came the distinct sensation of being watched. He spun around, his pulse hammering, but the hallway was empty save for his distorted reflections. Yet the feeling persisted, crawling up his spine and settling like ice in his chest. He turned back to the mirrors, and this time he wasn't alone. A shadowy figure stood behind him in the reflection, its outline faint but unmistakable. It was tall and thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if studying him with predatory curiosity. Alec whipped around, ready to confront whatever was there, but the hallway was empty. When he looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone, but its absence was somehow worse than its presence. The air grew heavier, pressing against him like a physical weight. A low hum resonated through the hallway, emanating from the mirrors themselves, their surfaces rippling more violently now. Alec's reflection stared at him, its expression blank, yet its eyes seemed to gleam with a malicious intent. As he took a step back, his reflection didn't move. Instead, it smiled, a slow, deliberate curl of the lips that didn't belong to him. Alec's breath came in short gasps, his hands trembling as he fumbled for the door. The hallway behind him seemed to close in, the mirrors narrowing, the distorted faces within them pressing closer. Somewhere deep in the house, the laughter returned, louder this time, echoing off the walls in a cacophony of mockery. And then a voice, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to seep from the mirrors themselves. "You shouldn't have come here." The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening finality, plunging Alec into complete darkness. Alec's heart pounded as he pressed deeper into the labyrinth of mirrors, the oppressive silence broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing. His steps echoed unnaturally, as if the walls were mimicking him in some sinister game. Each mirror reflected a warped version of himself, but now, something else began to emerge. Faint outlines appeared in the glass, objects, shapes, and figures that didn't belong to the hallway around him. It was as if the mirrors were windows to another world, one more sinister and fragmented than his own. He paused in front of one particularly large mirror. Its frame was intricately carved with patterns resembling vines, but they seemed to move subtly, writhing as if alive. The glass rippled, distorting his reflection into a grotesque caricature of himself. Then the mirror began to change. The hallway around him faded from the reflection, replaced by a different scene entirely. A small boy, sitting alone on the floor of what looked like a carnival funhouse. Alec froze as recognition hit him like a punch to the gut. The boy was himself, no older than 7, clutching a worn teddy bear with a button eye dangling precariously by a thread. The air around him seemed to grow colder as memories he had long buried surged to the surface. He hadn't thought about that day in years, the day he'd wandered into a house of mirrors at a traveling carnival and became hopelessly lost. In the reflection, the young Alec looked up suddenly, as though sensing he was being watched. His tear-streaked face turned toward the adult Alec, and his lips moved. At first, there was no sound, just the eerie movement of his mouth forming words. But then the whispers began, faint and fragmented, as though traveling across an impossible distance. "Why did you leave me here?" The question struck Alec with a paralyzing sense of dread. He stumbled backward, his eyes darting between the reflection and the empty hallway around him. The boy's words echoed in his mind, accompanied by a sharp, inexplicable pain in his arm. Clutching his sleeve, he rolled it up to reveal a scar he hadn't thought about in years, a jagged line on his forearm from when he'd fallen in the funhouse. But now it burned, the pain searing as though the wound had just been made. The reflection shifted again, and Alec saw himself as a child running frantically through the funhouse mirrors, his cries for help swallowed by the endless corridors. But there was something else in the reflection, something chasing him. A shadow, tall and unnatural, loomed behind the young Alec, its spindly arms reaching for him. Alec's breath hitched as he realized the shadow wasn't just in the reflection anymore. Turning his head slowly, he glanced behind him, half expecting to see the entity standing there. The hallway was empty, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable. When he looked back at the mirror, the scene had changed again. The boy was gone, replaced by a dark, foggy room filled with rows of identical mirrors. In the center stood a pedestal, and on it rested the same teddy bear the boy had been holding. Alec felt a pull, an invisible force compelling him to find that room. His legs moved almost on their own, each step dragging him deeper into the labyrinth. The mirrors around him began to whisper, voices overlapping in a sinister cacophony. Some were mournful, others mocking, but one phrase repeated over and over, "You left him." The whispers grew louder as he approached a new corridor, this one lined with shattered mirrors. Each shard seemed to hold a fragment of his past, images of him as a child, crying and calling out for help. One shard showed him clutching his arm, blood dripping onto the floor of the funhouse. Another showed him at the carnival's exit, tears streaming down his face as he was pulled away by an unseen adult, leaving the funhouse behind. Alec's knees buckled under the weight of the memories. He remembered now. He had run out of the funhouse in a blind panic, leaving behind something, or someone important. But how was it possible that the mansion knew about this? How could it dredge up something so personal and twist it into this waking nightmare? A sudden noise snapped him out of his spiraling thoughts. It was the sound of glass cracking. He turned toward the nearest mirror, and to his horror, he saw the boy again, this time older, his face gaunt and his eyes hollow. The boy raised a hand, pressing it against the other side of the glass. "You forgot me." The boy's voice was no longer a whisper. It was a guttural, agonized cry that reverberated through the hallway. Alec reached out instinctively, his palm meeting the cold surface of the mirror. The boy's expression twisted into something monstrous, his lips curling into a sneer. Then, the glass shattered completely, and Alec was thrown backward, the fragments raining down around him. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the hallway. He was in the room from the reflection, the one with the pedestal and the teddy bear. The whispers were deafening now, accusing him, mocking him, driving him to the brink of madness. As he approached the pedestal, he noticed something carved into its surface. "To find what you've lost, you must give up what you hold dear." The words filled Alec with a sense of foreboding. He reached for the teddy bear, but as his fingers grazed its surface, the room plunged into darkness. A voice, deep, cold, and inhuman, spoke from the shadows, "You should never have come back." The air grew thick, and Alec's vision blurred as the memories he had repressed for so long threatened to consume him entirely. He realized then that the past he had tried to forget was not done with him, and it never would be. The air in the room felt heavy, oppressive, as though Alec had wandered into the chest of some great, slumbering beast. The teddy bear on the pedestal seemed innocent enough, its button eye hanging by a thread, yet Alec couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching him. The whispers had subsided, replaced by an eerie stillness that made his skin crawl. His hand hovered over the bear, but something in the back of his mind screamed for him to stop. As his fingers grazed the worn fabric, the room changed. The mirrors along the walls began to shimmer, their surfaces glowing with a cold, silvery light. Images flickered within them like projections on a cracked screen. Alec saw moments from his life, his happiest days, his greatest failures, all playing out simultaneously. But there was something wrong with the reflections. The figures in the memories weren't quite right. Their movements were jerky, their faces subtly distorted, and their eyes glowed faintly, as if imbued with some otherworldly malice. Then the voice returned. Deep and resonant, it seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. A life built on abandonment, a soul fractured by regret. To leave is to lose, and to lose is to suffer. Alec's heart raced as the voice grew louder, each word slamming into him like a physical force. The mirrors rippled, their glass surfaces parting like water. From their depths emerged distorted versions of Alec himself, each one bearing the marks of a life he had not lived. A version with sunken eyes and claw-like hands, another with a twisted smile that stretched impossibly wide. They encircled him, blocking every possible escape. To leave this place, you must pay the price. The voice grew softer, more intimate, as if it were whispering directly into Alec's ear. Before him, the largest mirror shifted to show an image of his sister. She appeared as she had the last time he saw her, smiling, full of life, calling his name as they wandered into the funhouse. But then the image changed. Her face became pale, her eyes hollow. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, and her figure began to fade, as though being erased from existence. "You can save her," the voice murmured, "but only if you give up the part of yourself that keeps her alive." Alec stumbled back, his mind racing. He understood now. The house was offering him a choice, to erase his memory of his sister entirely, freeing himself from the guilt and grief that had haunted him, or to remain trapped in the house forever, his soul feeding whatever malevolent force controlled the mirrors. He looked down at the teddy bear. It was the one thing that tied him to her, the last remnant of a bond that had defined his childhood. To let it go would be to let her go completely, to erase every trace of her from his heart and mind. But to hold on to it meant surrendering himself to the house, to become one of the reflections that lingered in its cursed depths. "Choose," the voice demanded, its tone growing harsh and impatient. The distorted versions of Alec stepped closer, their inhuman features illuminated by the flickering glow of the mirrors. He could feel their cold breath on his skin, their eyes boring into him with predatory intent. Tears welled up in Alec's eyes as he gripped the teddy bear tightly. Memories of his sister flashed before him. Her laughter, her kindness, the way she had always been there for him, even when he had failed her. He couldn't let those memories go, no matter the cost. But what would happen if he chose to stay? Would he become one of these twisted reflections, a shadow of himself, forever trapped in the labyrinth? The mirrors began to pulse, the light within them growing brighter, harsher. The distorted figures reached out for him, their clawed hands inches from his face. Alec closed his eyes, his mind spiraling with fear and doubt. "What will you sacrifice?" the voice hissed, now crackling with malice. With a trembling hand, Alec raised the teddy bear. The room seemed to hold its breath, the mirrors freezing in place, their light dimming slightly. He stared at the worn fabric, the frayed stitching, and the tiny button eye. It was the last piece of her he had left. His chest tightened as he whispered to himself, I can't let her go." The voice roared in fury, the mirrors shattering in unison, sending shards of glass flying through the air. Alec dropped to the floor, covering his head as the fragments rained down around him. When he opened his eyes, the room was gone. He was back in the endless hallway, the shards of broken mirrors scattered across the floor like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't solve. But the teddy bear was gone. Alec's heart sank as he realized what had happened. The house had taken the choice away from him, forcing him to move forward without resolution. The whispers returned, louder now, their tone mocking and cruel. "You'll never leave. You'll never forget. She'll never forgive." He staggered to his feet, the weight of his decision, or lack thereof, pressing down on him like a leaden cloak. The hallway stretched out before him, darker and more foreboding than ever. Alec knew that the worst was yet to come. Alec's footsteps echoed in the labyrinth, each step resonating like a warning against the silence that surrounded him. The air felt thicker now, as if the house itself was breathing, exhaling its oppressive energy into the narrow corridors. He clutched his camera tightly, though the weight of it felt meaningless. The lens, his trusted shield from reality, couldn't protect him from whatever forces lurked within the mirrors. The hallway stretched infinitely in both directions, its walls lined with mirrors that seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly light. But the reflections no longer showed Alec's face. Instead, they displayed strange, distorted figures moving in the shadows, too fast, too fragmented to fully comprehend. He squinted, leaning closer to one of the mirrors, his breath fogging the glass. As his gaze deepened, the shadows began to coalesce into something tangible, a hand, pale and skeletal, reaching out from the darkness. The hand pressed against the other side of the glass, its long, jagged fingers leaving streaks as it dragged them downward. Alec staggered back, his heart pounding, but the reflection remained, the hand now clawing at the mirror as if desperate to break through. Then came the whispers. They started faintly, like wind slipping through cracks in the walls, but quickly grew louder, forming a chorus of disembodied voices. Some were mournful, pleading for help, while others were cruel and mocking, their words fragmented and incoherent. But amidst the chaos, one voice stood out, a low, guttural murmur that sent chills racing down Alec's spine. "You don't belong here," it hissed, the words sharp and venomous. Alec turned sharply, his eyes darting down the corridor, but there was no one there. The mirrors, however, began to tremble, their surfaces rippling like water disturbed by an unseen force. From the corner of his eye he caught movement, his reflection, or so he thought. But when he turned to face it, he realized it wasn't him at all. The figure in the mirror was taller, its features blurred and twisted. Its eyes were sunken pits of darkness, and its grin stretched unnaturally wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. The figure tilted its head, mimicking Alec's movements with a delay that made his stomach churn. And then, without warning, it moved on its own, stepping forward and pressing its face against the glass. "Leave while you can," it whispered, its voice a chilling echo of Alec's own. The figure raised a hand and slammed it against the mirror, the sound reverberating through the hallway. The glass cracked, spiderweb fractures spreading outward from the point of impact. Alec stumbled back, his pulse racing as the mirror began to distort further. The cracks seemed to bleed, thin streams of a black, tar-like substance seeping out and pooling on the floor. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as the black substance began to move, snaking toward Alec like living tendrils. He tried to run, but the floor beneath him felt sticky, pulling at his shoes as if the house itself was trying to hold him in place. Panic surged through him as he struggled to move, his breath coming in short, frantic gasps. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something even more horrifying. The shadows in the mirrors were no longer confined to their reflective prisons. They were spilling out into the hallway, dark, amorphous shapes slithering across the walls and ceiling. They moved with an unnatural fluidity, their forms constantly shifting and contorting as they closed in around him. Alec's legs finally obeyed him, and he sprinted down the corridor, his footsteps splashing in the black substance that now coated the floor. The whispers followed him, growing louder and more frantic, their words overlapping in a maddening cacophony. He turned a corner and skidded to a halt, his heart sinking as he realized he was back where he started. The mirrors on either side of him now displayed scenes from his past, moments he had tried to forget. In one, he saw himself as a child, crying and clutching his arm as blood dripped onto the floor of the funhouse. In another, he saw his sister's face, her expression frozen in a mixture of fear and betrayal. The images seemed to taunt him, their meanings twisted and unclear. "You left her," one of the whispers hissed, louder and more distinct than the others. Alec spun around, his eyes wide with terror. Standing behind him was a figure cloaked in shadow, its form barely distinguishable from the darkness around it. Its eyes glowed faintly, two pinpricks of malevolent light that seemed to pierce straight into Alec's soul. "You abandoned her," the figure continued, its voice a low growl. "And now, you'll never escape." The figure lunged at Alec, its movements swift and predatory. He raised his arms instinctively, but the figure passed through him like smoke, leaving behind a bone-chilling cold that seeped into his very core. He fell to his knees, gasping for breath, as the whispers reached a deafening crescendo. The mirrors around him shattered all at once, the sound echoing through the labyrinth like a scream. Alec was left kneeling in the darkness, shards of glass scattered around him, each piece reflecting a distorted version of his own face. The whispers faded into silence, but the oppressive sense of dread remained, heavier than ever. As he struggled to his feet, Alec realized the truth. The house wasn't just playing with him. It was unraveling him, stripping away every layer of his being until there was nothing left. And in the darkness, he could feel the shadows watching, waiting for their moment to claim him. The darkness around Alec was no longer passive. It felt alive, pressing against his skin like cold, clammy hands. Every breath he took was shallow and trembling, the air thick with the metallic tang of fear. The house had shifted again. The endless corridors of mirrors were gone, replaced by a single cavernous room. The walls, though still adorned with mirrors, now seemed to ripple and pulse as if they were breathing. Shadows flickered across their surfaces, whispering incomprehensible words that danced just beyond the edge of hearing. Alec stepped forward cautiously, his shoes crunching on what he thought was shattered glass. Looking down, he froze. The floor was covered in mirrors, each shard reflecting fragments of his face, his eyes wide with terror. But something was wrong. In each reflection, his expression was subtly different. Some showed him grinning maniacally, others weeping uncontrollably, and in a few, his eyes were hollow and black, staring back at him with lifeless malice. The whispers grew louder, their words coalescing into fragmented sentences. "Why do you run? You cannot hide. Face it, Alec. Face her." The final phrase sent a shiver racing down his spine. He spun around, scanning the room, but there was nothing there, nothing except his own distorted reflections staring at him from every surface. Yet he felt it, the undeniable presence of something watching him, its gaze like icy fingers tracing the back of his neck. The mirrors on the walls began to change, their surfaces rippling as new images emerged. Alec saw himself in each one, but not as he was now. These reflections depicted him in different moments of torment. In one, he was trapped in the funhouse as a child, his small fists pounding against the glass as the shadowy figure loomed behind him. In another, he was older, sitting alone in a dimly lit room, a bottle of whiskey in one hand and the teddy bear in the other, his face hollow with regret. But then one mirror caught his eye. It showed something he couldn't explain. It wasn't a memory, at least, not one he recognized. The reflection depicted him standing in the room he was in now, but he wasn't alone. A figure stood behind him, its face obscured by shadows, its hand resting on his shoulder. Alec turned sharply, but there was no one there. When he looked back at the mirror, the figure in the reflection was smiling, a slow, predatory grin that chilled him to the bone. "You can't escape it," the whispers hissed. "It's already inside you." Alec stumbled back, his pulse pounding in his ears. The room seemed to shrink around him, the walls closing in as the shadows grew darker, denser. The mirrors on the floor began to glow faintly, their fractured surfaces emitting a cold, silvery light. He saw new images now, visions of himself succumbing to the house, his body merging with the shadows, his face becoming one of the twisted, grotesque figures that haunted the mirrors. Panic clawed at his chest as the room shifted again. The mirrors on the walls began to stretch, their frames warping as they bent toward him. Their surfaces bulged outward, as though something inside was trying to break free. He backed away, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but the mirrors surrounded him, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. "Look at yourself," they commanded. "See the truth." Against his will, Alec's gaze was drawn to the nearest mirror. His reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't just his face he saw. Behind him, the shadowy figure loomed closer, its features becoming clearer. It was a woman, or at least it had been. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes empty sockets that seemed to bleed darkness. Her mouth twisted into a cruel smile as she leaned closer to Alec's reflection, her hands gripping his shoulders. "Do you remember me?" she whispered, her voice cutting through the cacophony like a blade. Alec's knees buckled as a wave of memories flooded his mind. He saw himself as a child, running through the funhouse, his sister calling out to him. He had been so scared, so desperate to escape, that he hadn't looked back. And now here she was, twisted, broken, her presence warped by the house's malevolence. "You left me," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of sorrow and rage. "And now you'll stay. Just like I did." The mirrors around him shattered simultaneously, the sound deafening. Alec fell to the floor, his body trembling as shards of glass rained down around him. When he opened his eyes, the room was gone. He was back in the hallway, but something was different. The air was colder, the darkness deeper. And in the distance, he could hear her voice, singing a haunting, mournful lullaby. The temptation of fear had taken hold. Alec realized with a sinking dread that the house wasn't just showing him his fears. It was feeding on them, growing stronger with every step he took. And somewhere in the labyrinth, his sister waited, her presence a cruel reminder of the choice he hadn't been able to make. The hallway stretched endlessly before Alec, the air thick with an unnatural chill that bit at his skin. The faint sound of the haunting lullaby echoed through the darkness, growing louder with each hesitant step he took. He clutched his camera as if it could protect him, but the weight of it now felt insignificant. The house was no longer just a labyrinth of mirrors. It was alive, pulsating with a sinister intent, and Alec was trapped in its beating heart. The lullaby stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed against Alec's ears. He stumbled into a new room, the transition so sudden it was as if the house had swallowed him whole. The walls were covered with mirrors, each one impossibly tall and stretching into the shadows above. Their surfaces shimmered, not with reflections, but with shifting images, scenes from Alec's life. He saw himself as a child, running through the funhouse, his sister's voice calling after him. He saw himself as an adult, sitting alone in his apartment, staring at the teddy bear that had been her favorite. Then the images changed. They no longer showed memories, but instead depicted something far more horrifying. In one mirror, he saw his own reflection, but it was not human. His eyes were black pits, his skin pale and cracked like old porcelain. In another, he stood amidst the shattered remains of the funhouse, his sister's voice screaming accusations at him, though her face was obscured by shadow. "This is your truth," the voice whispered, deep and guttural, reverberating through the room. Alec spun around, but the room was empty. The mirrors, however, began to ripple, their surfaces stretching outward as if something inside was trying to escape. One by one, the reflections of himself stepped out of the glass, their twisted forms solidifying. Each one bore a different expression: rage, sorrow, fear, malice, all emotions Alec had buried deep within himself. The reflections circled him, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by an unseen puppeteer. "You left her," one reflection hissed, its voice a distorted echo of Alec's own. "You chose yourself," another snarled, its black eyes narrowing. "Now you'll pay," a third whispered, its grin wide and cruel. Alec stumbled back, his heart hammering against his ribs. The reflections closed in, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of blame and torment. He tried to shout, to deny their accusations, but his voice failed him. The weight of his guilt pressed down on him like an iron shroud. Then, from the largest mirror, a new figure emerged. It was her, his sister, but she was no longer the vibrant, laughing girl he remembered. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow voids, and her hair hung in damp, tangled strands. She wore the same dress she had on the day she disappeared, now tattered and stained. "Alec," she said, her voice soft yet filled with sorrow, "why didn't you come back for me?" Her words struck him like a physical blow, and he fell to his knees. Tears streamed down his face as he tried to speak, to explain, but his throat closed around the words. She stepped closer, her bare feet leaving dark stains on the mirrored floor. "You ran," she continued, her tone shifting to one of quiet fury. "You left me in the dark, and now it's your turn to stay." The room began to change again. The mirrors around them cracked and shattered, the shards swirling through the air like razor-sharp leaves caught in a storm. Alec shielded his face as the fragments cut into his skin, each one whispering a single word: "Stay." He looked up to see his sister standing directly in front of him. Her hand reached out, trembling, as if she were offering him a chance to make amends. But her eyes betrayed her true intent. They were not filled with forgiveness, but with the same darkness that consumed the house. "There's only one way out," she said, her voice now a blend of her own and the guttural tone of the house itself. "Give yourself to me." Alec's breath caught in his throat as he realized what she meant. The house didn't want to let him go. It wanted to claim him, to make him a part of its twisted reality, just as it had done to her. He could feel its pull, a cold, unrelenting force tugging at his very soul. In that moment, he had a choice. He could surrender to the house, to his guilt, and to the darkness that had haunted him for years. Or he could fight, even if it meant confronting the most terrifying parts of himself. With trembling hands, Alec reached into his bag and pulled out the camera. It was a relic of his past, a tool he had used to control the world around him. Now it felt like his only weapon. He raised it to his eye and focused on the figure of his sister. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking, "but I won't let you take me." He pressed the shutter. The flash filled the room with a blinding light, and the darkness recoiled with a deafening screech. The reflections shattered, the shadows dissipated, and the figure of his sister dissolved into smoke, her anguished scream echoing as she disappeared. When the light faded, Alec was alone. The room was empty, the mirrors gone, leaving only a faint hum in the air. But he knew the house wasn't finished with him. This was just the beginning of its cruel game. And somewhere, deep in the labyrinth, it was waiting for him to falter again. The room trembled as the house responded to Alec's defiance. The air grew colder, stinging his skin and making his breath visible in sharp, panicked puffs. The shattered mirrors on the floor began to rise, their fragments floating unnaturally, spinning in the air like malevolent shards of a broken soul. The walls groaned and shifted, the house warping itself into something new, something more hostile, more alive. Alec stumbled backward, clutching his camera like a lifeline, as the room twisted and folded around him. What had been a cavernous hall of mirrors was now an impossible geometry of jagged edges and shifting shadows. The floor beneath him cracked and gave way, plunging him into darkness. He fell, his scream swallowed by the void, until he landed with a painful thud on a cold, hard surface. When Alec opened his eyes, he was in a circular chamber, its walls lined with enormous mirrors that stretched endlessly upward, their surfaces impossibly clear. The faint glow of an otherworldly light illuminated the room, casting eerie, shifting patterns on the floor. In the center stood a single mirror unlike the others. Its frame was blackened and twisted, as if scorched by fire, and its glass shimmered with a darkness so deep it seemed to absorb all light around it. From the mirror, a figure began to emerge. At first, it was nothing but a vague silhouette, a writhing shadow that grew more solid with each passing second. Then it stepped fully into the room, and Alec's blood ran cold. It was his sister, or what was left of her. Her features were warped, her body elongated and gaunt, her skin pale and cracked like porcelain left too long in the sun. Her eyes were black voids, swirling with a malevolence that made Alec's chest tighten. But it was her smile that unnerved him the most. It was wide, impossibly so, stretching across her face in a way that felt both mocking and hungry. "Alec," she said, her voice a haunting echo that seemed to reverberate from every corner of the chamber. "You've come so far, but you cannot escape. Not from me. Not from yourself." He backed away, his legs trembling, but the chamber offered no escape. The walls of mirrors closed in, the reflections twisting and distorting until they showed not just Alec, but versions of himself he didn't recognize, angrier, broken, and consumed by guilt. "Why did you leave me?" she asked, stepping closer. Each word was laced with venom, her voice filled with both sorrow and rage. "You ran, Alec. You ran, and you never looked back." "I didn't know," he stammered, his voice cracking. "I was scared. I was just a kid." Her laughter filled the chamber, sharp and bitter. "Scared? Do you think I wasn't? Do you think I didn't scream for you to come back? You left me in the dark, and now it's your turn." The shadows around her began to writhe, coalescing into monstrous shapes with jagged claws and hollow eyes. They moved toward Alec, their forms unnatural and jerking, as though they were being pulled by unseen strings. He raised his camera instinctively, snapping a photo. The flash erupted in a burst of light, and the shadows recoiled, hissing like serpents. But the respite was brief. The shadows reformed, their movements more deliberate now, their eyes fixed on Alec with unrelenting malice. "You can't fight this," she said, her voice low and resonant. "This house, this darkness, it's a part of you. You belong to it, just as I do." Alec's mind raced. The house was feeding on his fear, his guilt. Every step deeper into its labyrinth had been a test, a trap to break him. He realized then that the final confrontation wasn't just with the entity that had taken his sister. It was with himself. The shadowy figure of his sister lunged at him, her clawed hands outstretched. Alec barely dodged, the sound of her nails scraping against the floor echoing through the chamber. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes darting to the twisted mirror at the room's center. It wasn't just a mirror, it was the source. The darkness pulsing from its surface was palpable, a living, breathing malevolence that had ensnared them both. If he could destroy it, maybe he could end this nightmare. Summoning every ounce of courage he had left, Alec darted toward the mirror. The shadows lashed out at him, their claws grazing his skin, leaving searing trails of pain. His sister's distorted laughter filled the air, a cacophony of mockery and rage. "You'll never escape," she screamed, her voice shaking the walls. Alec reached the mirror and hesitated for a split second, his reflection staring back at him. But this time, it wasn't twisted or malevolent. It was him, just him, tired and afraid, but resolute. With a shout, he raised the camera and hurled it at the mirror with all his strength. The glass shattered on impact, the sound deafening. Light exploded from the fragments, blinding and pure, driving back the shadows and the figure of his sister. She let out a piercing scream, her form dissolving into the light as the chamber began to collapse. Alec shielded his eyes, the brightness consuming everything around him. When the light faded, he found himself outside the house. The fog had lifted, and the morning sun bathed the landscape in a warm, golden glow. Alec stared at the ruins of the mansion, now nothing more than a charred foundation and scattered debris. But the relief was short-lived. As he turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of something in a shard of glass on the ground, a reflection. It wasn't his own. It was hers, watching him with that same haunting smile. The house might have been destroyed, but Alec knew the darkness wasn't gone. It had left its mark on him, and somewhere deep in the void, it was waiting for him to falter again. Alec stood in the pale morning light, the ruins of the house smoldering behind him. The fog had dissipated, revealing the jagged outlines of the barren landscape, but the air still carried a chill that seeped into his bones. He clutched his arms tightly, his hands trembling not from the cold, but from the lingering weight of what he had just endured. Every breath felt heavy, as if the house had taken something from him, a piece of his soul that he would never get back. He turned to leave, but his foot brushed against something on the ground. Looking down, his heart stopped. It was a fragment of the twisted mirror, its edges sharp and glinting faintly in the sunlight. Against his better judgment, Alec crouched to pick it up. The surface was pristine, unnaturally clean, and when he looked into it, he didn't see his own reflection. Instead, the shard revealed the same endless labyrinth of mirrors he had fought to escape. Shadows flickered within the fragment, their movements erratic, as if aware they were being watched. Then, out of the corner of the shard, a face appeared. It was her, his sister. Her expression was calm, almost serene, but her eyes, those void-like eyes, locked onto his, sending a cold shiver racing down his spine. "This isn't over, Alec," her voice whispered, faint and distant, yet unmistakable. Startled, Alec dropped the shard. It landed with a sharp crack on the ground, splitting into even smaller pieces. But the image of his sister didn't fade. Her fragmented face stared back at him from every piece, each one carrying the same eerie smile. The realization hit him like a blow. He hadn't escaped the house. Not completely. He backed away, his chest tightening as the whispers began again. They were faint, carried on the wind, but their meaning was clear. "You're part of it now." Alec tried to calm his racing thoughts, his mind replaying every moment of the nightmare he had just survived. The house had consumed so many, trapping them in its endless mirrors. But why had it let him go? Or had it? As he stared at the shards, a terrifying thought began to creep into his mind. What if he hadn't escaped at all? What if the world he now stood in was just another reflection, a carefully constructed illusion meant to keep him trapped? The edges of the landscape around him seemed too sharp, too vivid, as if painted with exaggerated detail. The sky above him was clear, unnaturally so, with not a single cloud to mar its perfect blue. Alec began to walk, his steps quickening as his anxiety grew. The ground beneath him felt solid, but there was a strange echo with each footfall, as though he were walking on hollow glass. He glanced behind him, half expecting to see the house reappear, but there was nothing, only the endless expanse of barren land. Then he saw it, a figure in the distance, standing perfectly still. Alec squinted, his heart pounding as he tried to make out its features. The figure was human-like but distorted, its outline shimmering as if viewed through rippling water. It began to move toward him, its jerky, unnatural gait sending a wave of nausea through his body. Alec froze, his breath catching in his throat. The figure stopped just a few meters away, its face obscured by shadow. But its voice was clear, cutting through the silence like a blade. "Did you think it would let you go?" The voice was his own. Alec stumbled back, his mind reeling as the figure stepped into the light. It was him, an exact copy but twisted. The reflection's eyes were sunken, its skin pale and cracked, and its mouth curled into a cruel, mocking grin. "You can't run," the reflection said, its voice dripping with malice. "You'll always belong to the house." "To me." Alec turned and ran, his legs burning with exertion as he sprinted across the desolate landscape. The whispers grew louder, the sound of shattering glass echoing all around him. He didn't dare look back, but he could feel the reflection chasing him, its presence growing closer with each step. As he ran, the ground beneath him began to change. The barren earth cracked and splintered, revealing mirrored surfaces beneath the dirt. With every step, the reflections of his face stared back at him, their expressions twisted with fear, anger, and despair. The landscape itself was a trap, a sprawling reflection that stretched endlessly in every direction. Alec stopped abruptly, his chest heaving as he realized the truth. He wasn't running toward freedom. He was running deeper into the labyrinth. "There's no escape," the whispers said in unison, their voices overlapping in a maddening chorus. The reflection appeared before him again, blocking his path. Its grin widened as it held out its hand, beckoning him to accept his fate. Behind it, the ground splintered and collapsed, revealing a swirling void of darkness that seemed to pulse with the house's malevolent energy. Alec dropped to his knees, the weight of the realization crushing him. He was trapped, not in the house, but in its reflection, a liminal space where time and reality blurred. The house had taken his sister, and now it had taken him. The reflection knelt beside him, its voice soft and mocking. "You'll see, Alec. It's not so bad. We're all just reflections in the end." The last thing Alec saw before the darkness consumed him was his sister's face in the shattered shards of the ground, her hollow eyes staring, her lips forming a single word. "Stay." And then silence.